Welcome to episode 3 of the Future of Energy podcast, sponsored by the Oshagi Center for Energy Transition at the University of Southern California. While all of our guests are special, we may have outdone ourselves with this interview. In our episode today, we have a little bit different format where we went on the road and traveled to Denver, Colorado, to the headquarters of Liberty Energy, to talk to their CEO, Chris Wright, about the future of oil and gas. Our program sponsor, Kyle Kerner, is the moderator. Fossil fuels make up over 80% of the energy we use globally. So if there's going to be a meaningful energy transition, we must develop solutions to replace this traditional, energy-dense, proven source in the context of rising energy demand. That's a big challenge that Mr. Wright describes. He earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and a master's degree in electrical engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he was a graduate student in electrical engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, and at MIT. Chris is passionate about any form of energy that improves human lives. We have so much to talk about with Chris Wright that, and his responses were so informative that we divided the segment into 9 episodes. And to add some more information, we added a Did You Know segment as segues between our conversations. As a spoiler alert, and just a name drop, Chris Wright is the new Energy Secretary for the new administration in Washington. So listen closely. Take a lot of notes, just like we did.
Well, it's a pleasure to bring the transition talk to Denver. We're at the corporate headquarters of Liberty Energy, and we're with CEO Chris Wright. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Glad to be here, Kyle.
Well, let's get to it.
Absolutely.
So you've said that affordable, reliable energy alone won't cure the world's problems. There's a lot of disparities in human rights, education, welfare, and health outcomes. And I know that's near and dear to your heart. But you also said that there's no cure without reliable, affordable energy. And maybe to put a finer point on it, you've said that the hydrocarbon-dominated energy is not just the sector of the economy, a sector of the economy, but it is the sector that enables every other sector. So how are we dependent on oil and gas, and shouldn't we strive to break that addiction?
Well, energy is just the infrastructure of our world. Everything we do, whatever it is, requires energy from somewhere. And hydrocarbons really transform the world by just being a massively superior form of energy from what we had before, which was wood and biomass was the dominant energy in the world. But if you look at our world today, 8 billion people, 50% of our food production would disappear if we just got rid of one use of hydrocarbons, which is nitrogen to make, natural gas to make synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. That's just game changing. Sri Lanka did an experiment where they went to all organic fertilizers. Within 6 months, the president flew the country. Production had declined, prices had skyrocketed. One movement away from one use of a hydrocarbon. Just all our materials, our clothes, our buildings, our roads, everything we do, our modern medicine, that's basically hydrocarbons in action. So yeah, they started as a new thing 150 years ago, and they're just so interwoven in the materials, in the energy, in food production, in transport. They're interwoven into everything we do.
Can you tell us more about the pillars of modern civilization and why they're so dependent on oil and gas?
Yeah, to borrow a great term from really the best energy scholar of our time, Václav Smil, originally from the Czech Republic. He now lives in rural Canada. He termed 4 materials, the 4 pillars of the modern world: cement, steel, plastics and petrochemicals, and fertilizers. Yeah. We produce all of those measured in either billions of tons per year or hundreds of millions of tons per year. 20% of global energy is used just to make those 4 materials. Steel, high temperature process heat. Steel is iron and carbon. That heat
Yes.
comes from hydrocarbons, that carbon comes from hydrocarbons. To make cement, another hugely energy intensive reaction that we not only use to process heat from hydrocarbons, but we use molecules from hydrocarbons as catalysts in a chemical reaction. Plastics and petrochemicals, they are hydrocarbons. They are taking the molecules of hydrocarbons into different forms to make also medical materials, clothes, paintings, cosmetics, um, and plastics, containers, everything. And then fertilizers, which were really game changing. Before the invention of modern fertilizers, I mean, there were ships sailing around the world collecting bird guano from off the coast of Peru because you need synthetic nitrogen into soils. The air is full of nitrogen, but plants can't utilize that chemically. We needed nitrogen in a form that it could be used for productivity of agriculture. Just game changing. This Haber-Bosch process from a little over 100 years ago. High temperature process heat from methane gas and the hydrogen molecule from methane gas to bond with nitrogen from air creates ammonia or urea. Just world changing.
So just the components of the hydrocarbons, but also the process heat that they allow supports all these four pillars. There's really no substitute that we know of. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair. The biggest, we talk a lot about transportation and electricity and housing and heating, which are all great forms of energy. The most important use of energy by far is high temperature process heat. Industrial usage of energy is almost 50% of all energy consumption. And today it comes from wood, coal, oil, and gas. Got to combust something to get the very high temperatures to produce materials, including polysilicon, which takes particularly high temperatures to make solar panels. Even to make all our other forms of energy takes an intense amount of hydrocarbons. I call them derivative energy sources.
Okay. So we like to ask our interviewees, Chris, what does the energy transition mean to you? And you're on record saying that you think that's a misnomer. I think you've talked about there being additions to energy, our basis in hydrocarbons. But there is a transition coming. I'd like to talk with you about that and what might it include? We talked about the additions, and I'd like you to go into that some more. But with our growing energy needs, a lot of us have said, well, we need an all of the above strategy, and I think you've taken issue with that. So just in brief, not a transition, but additions now, and not necessarily an all of the above strategy. Could you go into both of those aspects?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, my life, I went to college 40 years ago to work on fusion energy because there was a widespread belief then that we were running out of hydrocarbons. Can't have a modern world without immense amounts of energy. You can't lift everyone else out of poverty without more energy than we have today. So I went to MIT specifically to work on fusion energy. I remain a huge advocate for nuclear energy because we need more energy and better energy for a better world. Uh, I worked in solar energy in graduate school and geothermal energy soon after. So I don't come from a hydrocarbon background at all. But I come from a passion about energy and a passion about honesty. I think when we mix politics and feel good emotions with energy policy, the results aren't good. And energy transition, I think, is one of those words that's become sort of political and emotional. We hate fossil fuels, so we're going away from it. We're in the middle of an energy transition, so mainstream politicians can oppose building pipelines and doing sensible stuff because we're not going to need it soon. We're in a transition. So as a data geek, I dive into the data and did again more recently. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War, we got 85% of our energy from hydrocarbons. 85% in 1973. It dipped all the way down to 83% in the year 2000. Yeah. And if you look at last year's data, 2023, 85% from hydrocarbons, exactly the same market share as we had in 1973. So I don't know how you can honestly call that an energy trend. It's just not happening. And over that 50-year period, demand for natural gas has grown 3% compound annual growth rate for 50 years. Coal has grown 2% compound annual growth rate for 50 years. And oil has grown 1% compound annual growth rate over those 50 years. Oil is the most expensive by a meaningful margin of those three energy sources, but it's also the most flexible. So there's trade-offs there. But all of them are at record high demand today. All of them are growing, and all of them are going to grow for the foreseeable future. So I think energy transition is just not an honest term. That being said, I'm all in for new energy sources that are additive. Nuclear energy is an enormous resource. It works whether the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. It can deliver a lot of energy in a small amount of land. Heck, a million years from now, we could use nuclear energy to create the molecules of hydrocarbons. We'll never live without hydrocarbon molecules. Even if the world ran out of hydrocarbon molecules, which will never happen, we need those molecules. They have to come from somewhere. But I'm not all of the above because politicians subsidize things that sound good, that emotionally feel good. And wind and solar are sort of the poster childs of that. We've spent somewhere between $4 and $10 trillion investing in them over the last 25 years. Last year, they were 2.6% of global energy, and their main impact was to make electricity more expensive in the locales where they achieved a high penetration rate. I'm not for that. I'm not for subsidizing businessmen to make money off the backs of ratepayers, and I'm not for making electricity more expensive and less reliable. So I'm not all of the above. I'm for everything that betters human lives.
Well, Chris, you also say that there's trade-offs to be considered when we look at energy, climate, and poverty around the world. Uh, you know that you're passionate about trying to make a cut into energy poverty, particularly in the developing. And uh, how do we decide as a globe? We share a global climate. What's the right mix around affordable, reliable energy, working to mitigate issues around the climate, but also bring those uh, deserving folks in the developing world standard of living and their life expectancy up. And how should we consider what that right mix is? Can you expand on that for us?
You bet. Well, so the first answer is the good news is we don't decide. You and I don't decide. The US government doesn't decide. Rich country governments don't decide. Like that's a decision that's going to be made everywhere, locally, in different conditions, different trade offs by different governments, by municipal governments, and by individuals. And there's just no chance people are going to lock in. I'm going to stay in poverty. I'm not going to get clean cooking fuel. I'm not going to have kids with access to modern medicine and more opportunities in their life. Because if I don't do that and everyone else does the same thing, the world will be a few tenths of a degree cooler at the end of the century. Like very few people are going to make that decision. And so the answer I get back to people is, well, then we in the rich country, if we show the way, then people will follow the way. The problem is, if I look at the leaders right now, Germany, the United Kingdom, California, they made energy expensive. They made energy unreliable. The energy intensive manufacturing and the blue collar jobs that go with it have just left those locales to somewhere else. They made their people poorer, reduced their standard of living. Heck, California, with everything in the world going for it, has the highest adjusted poverty rate of any state in the nation. People aren't going to follow that. That's not a model that'll be adopted and taken wider. So this to me is a little bit too much of just the politicization of energy. Do we want a cleaner energy system? Do we want to be aware of and address climate change? Absolutely. The world's been decarbonizing for 200 years from wood to coal to oil to gas to nuclear. That's naturally happening. The biggest source of reduced greenhouse gas emission and pollutants in the atmosphere in the last 2 decades, by far and away, is the rapid growth of natural gas. That's driven by market forces. It's cheaper and cleaner when it's pipeline accessible natural gas, not when it's LNG natural gas. But it's growing, it's taking market share. The Clean Air Act 50 years ago in the United States to remove pollutants out of the atmosphere was sort of sensible environmental regulation where the cost could make the air cheaper, could make the air so much cleaner that everyone embraced those trade-offs. And you and I breathe wildly cleaner air today than when we grew up. That is awesome. But we just need that sobriety in the decision-making trade-off. The last thing I'll end with is there's a whole study of this, climate economics. William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize in 2018 for studying these trade-offs about climate policy versus energy policy and energy costs. Richard Toll is another British economist who's become quite famous writing on this. And the conclusions they have all said are quite aligned with mine, which is that we should do the ones that make sense. Or if you increase energy costs by $1, you get multiple dollars of improvement. But most everything we're doing today, we spend $1 and we get a nickel or a dime improvement decades in the future. It's just an impoverishment program. Even if you were the Cuba in charge of the world, nobody would invest trillions of dollars and turn those dollars into dimes or nickels. That's politics. That's not sensible trade-offs being made.
So you hint at some optimism for the future that common sense will try to take hold, these global policymakers, and we'll get back to some good sense around the trade-offs that we have and trying to concentrate on the betterment of humanity as opposed to creating some fictional net zero carbon emissions goal. So that's wonderful, and I'm hopeful as well that that comes into the mix. It seems to be that sometimes in the West that we are looking at a deindustrialization kind of mindset that is really going to take us back into higher levels of mortality and certainly doesn't lift up the people that are striving to improve their lives around the globe. So I'll share your optimism. Well, Chris, your Bettering Human Lives Foundation is devoted to trying to eradicate, at least in part, energy poverty around the world, particularly in the developing world. Why do you think that's a more noble goal than reaching that net zero emissions that we have put out there for 2050? And by ending energy poverty, you seem to advocate for more use of hydrocarbons, and won't that lead to more pollution around the world? And won't that outstrip our ability to supply this new demand curve?
So, yeah, our Bettering Human Lives Foundation, I've talked about this for years. We launched the foundation just in January of this year. Our model is low interest loans to entrepreneurs in Africa that are already supplying clean cooking fuels, and we're helping them scale and grow their business. Over 80% of Africans are still cooking their daily meals and heating their homes, mostly burning wood, dung, and charcoal, also agricultural waste, but broadly solid biomass. The indoor air pollution from that kills a little over 3 million people a year from World Health Organization estimates, millions of easily preventable deaths per year. And the answer is simple. We have the answer. It's just a simple cook stove and propane canister. It's what all rural Americans, if you live at a farm or a rural area, or you got a mountain house and you're off the methane pipe grid, like you're burning propane. I have a house in Montana, it runs on propane. So they 2.1 billion people strive for that same luxury. And not only is it cleaner air in their households, that's what's driving me, save the lives. For the African families, a bigger thing is the liberation of women. Women have to either spend hours either gathering wood, or if it's charcoal, then they can buy it in bundles, but they've got to heat it and stoke that fire up to a high enough flame to cook, and then tamp that fire down so they don't waste all the charcoal before the next cooking or the evening heating. So it's liberating for the time of women. It's dramatically cleaner air inside. To me, it's just an absolute home run. And for tens of dollars of investment into our lending fund, You transition a family that takes the biggest step from abject poverty to lifestyles like you and I, is those hours back, that clean air back, that freedom back by having a propane cook stove that they can turn on and turn off. Now, to your other points, pollution, of course, it's a dramatic reducer of pollution. You burn propane or methane, that's wildly cleaner than burning wood or dung or charcoal or coal. So to burn a gaseous hydrocarbon, much better than to burn solid carbon-based fuels. It actually reduces greenhouse gas emissions too. Wealthy countries have policies for carbon abatement that they will make loans for clean cooking fuels, but only with certification of the carbon and the trade-off. So no small villages or entrepreneurs can do that. That's going to be international NGOs. There's been one of those done that turned out to be sadly almost a scam. And so to me, that's focusing on the penny worth of benefit from the minute reduction in greenhouse gases instead of the 99 cents of benefit of cleaner air, higher quality liberation of women, and better standard of livings. We need to keep our focus on humans. The atmosphere is important, and we'll come back to that, but it's never more important than humans. And the importance of the atmosphere is how does it impact human lives? That's the problem with this net zero 2050 goal. As I mentioned, William Nordhaus, Nobel Prize winning climate economist, he's not unfamiliar in this area. His answer for the best climate policy was do a few things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions where the cost to do them is less than the benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions at the margin. So and he used kind of a larger positive feedback warming scenario where maybe the planet would warm by 3.5 degrees by the end of this century. We're nowhere near on track to get there. But so he used a more extreme warming example. And with his policy interventions, the warming becomes maybe 2.8 or 3 degrees instead of 3.5, because those are the interventions that made sense. But going to the interventions to get to net zero emissions by 2050, which is impossible anyway, but even trying as hard as you can to get there, you're actually just causing far more damage in impoverishing people, crimping opportunities, and shorting lives than you're getting in benefits from reduced climate damages. Now, we don't know the future, so there's a wide range of projections on this, but even using the outliers, the largest estimates of damage from climate change, show that at the end of this century, humans might be 3, 4, or in the high end, 5% per capita poorer than they would be without any climate change. But that's in an economic model where we're 400% richer. So if your great great grandchildren are only 380% richer than you instead of 400% richer than you, that's a bummer. But that's not on scale with many millions of needless deaths today from people unable to afford abundant access to energy that gives us the lives we have. To me, that's not a hard trade-off to see which one's more important.
Yeah. And we're on track for spending untold trillions of dollars in the West and potentially bankrupting the West, trying to meet these unrealistic goals. And it's a global environment. And there's a lot of people in countries that are not participating in that same goal. We're not aligned as a planet. China's emissions, India's emissions are only going to increase over time. And so in the West, we can try to lead by example, but we all share the same climate. And so the better investments in the West are to go after helping bring up the world's poor to give them opportunity. So I applaud you with this.
I agree. And look, there's a lot of criticism of China and India building a lot of coal plants, and their emissions are growing rapidly, where US emissions peaked 30 years ago. They're on a slow, gradual decline. But I don't criticize India and China for rising emissions. Yes, that's more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Yes, that's absorbing more infrared radiation. Yes, that's going to contribute to a little more warming. But they're lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. They're bringing electricity and heating and jobs and higher incomes and better lives to their population. Boy, if I was in China or India, I'd be making the same decisions they are. God bless them.
So, Chris, you've been instrumental in the U.S. shale revolution, and I wondered if you could explain to our listeners what is that shale revolution? What has it meant for U.S. energy security, and as well as the climate and bettering human lives around the world?
Wow. Yeah. So look, again, as a guy who went to work on fusion power, solar power, next generation geothermal, I was all about, improvements, advancements in our energy system. I had no idea working in the Barnett Shale in the late 1990s that these different frac ideas we were trying out and this mapping of how fractures grow and maybe this larger contact area, the way the fractures grow was going to allow production from this Barnett Shale. We had no idea what it would ultimately lead to. But Kyle, to ask what has it meant? Well, if you go back in time, you go back about 15 years ago, the United States was the largest importer of natural gas of any country on the planet. And at that time, we were running over 1,000 rigs drilling for natural gas. Today, we're running 100 rigs drilling for natural gas, 90% less rigs drilling. And we've gone from the world's largest importer of natural gas to the world's largest exporter of natural gas. Like that is geopolitical, earth shaking. Oil, it's a similar story. We were by far and away the largest importer of oil just 15 years ago. Today, we're a net exporter of oil and oil products, liquid fuels, net exporter from the world's largest importer. So that's great geopolitically for the United States, this huge energy abundance here. But bigger is when you bring a surge of oil production on and a surge of natural gas production on through the shale revolution, what does it mean when you fire up supply? Lower prices. And I did the simple math, averaging the prices of these commodities over a time period before the shale revolution impacts and then after, and you get to somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion less expenditures of the world's consumers on energy from these lower prices. That to me, single best thing of the shale revolution. We've made everyone on the planet, all at varying amounts, $1 to $2 trillion richer, better off, more opportunity rich lives by lowering the cost of this essential ingredient in everything they do, oil and natural gas. And special about the shale revolution, where we produce light oil, and then what's between light oil and natural gas is natural gas liquids, propane right in that stack. So we've more than doubled our oil production, roughly doubled our natural gas production. We've around quadrupled our propane production. And although hydrocarbons, oil and gas are awesome, my favorite one of all is propane because that's the fuel that low income people and rural people can change their lives, make their lives cleaner, healthier, longer, better. So shale revolution has had tremendous benefits for consumers of the world, particularly low income consumers. It's been great economically for the United States, and it's changed geopolitics. The United States produces today more than 50% more oil than Saudi Arabia, vastly more natural gas than Russia. It used to be the world's largest producer of natural gas. Um, we're able to when the Russia-Ukraine war started and they shut down not all, only a chunk of Russian natural gas imports to Europe. The biggest filler of that hole was natural gas from the United States to support our friends and allies in an energy space. So the shale revolutions early on, it's transformed the United States. I think in the next few generations, it'll ultimately spread to other countries and it'll transform the cost of energy and opportunities they have as well.
So, Chris, you have a background in nuclear energy, and you've mentioned that as being an energy source that if we were wise about meeting future energy demands, that we would be constructing more nuclear reactors. You're investing some in modular reactors. Could you tell us something about that? And then more broadly, what are those factors that are limiting adoption of building more nuclear reactors around the world?
Yeah, guys, I said I'm for all energy that can better human lives. What's great about nuclear is you can take a small amount of land and a small amount of materials and produce a lot of energy. Those are the key, those are the key fundamental concepts you need to make a viable energy source. We've continued down a road of increased energy density. Nuclear is the next step. And today we hear a lot about wind and solar. They're in the electricity sector. That delivers 20% of global energy. Very important 20%, critically important 20%. But as we talked earlier, the biggest use of energy is high temperature process heat. Nuclear today, it just provides electricity. It could provide high temperature process heat. So I look at nuclear long run as something that really could grow its market share in global energy. It was about 6% in the year 2000. It's down to 4% today. It's not that nuclear shrunk, it's roughly flat. We've shut down nuclear power plants in the wealthy countries and built more in developing countries, but the energy pie's gotten bigger. And your answer, why? Why hasn't it grown? And I think that the fundamental reason is fear. It's easier to scare people than it is to reassure people. Fear is a very powerful political force. And so people don't like nuclear, they find it scary, or they don't like industrial society. Protesting against nuclear, when we were young, was a big avenue for that, and it was very effective. And of course, we built a lot of first generation reactors that needed an active cooling system to keep them from melting down. So that was a riskier design than maybe we should have had. But we had meltdowns, worst of all, certainly in the reactor in Ukraine, why am I blanking on Chernobyl. And then we had the cooling system get flooded in Japan at Fukushima. And those were bad things, but the result of even a meltdown was actually not that bad. The nuclear material, the cost of evacuating people, I think, caused far more damage than the relatively modest radiation levels that were there.
Right.
So if you look all in on nuclear, I think it's been the safest way to produce energy, bar none, that we've had in the last 50 years. So I think the data doesn't align with the fear factor, but the fear factor in the US has also driven a regulatory environment that's so over the top that it's made nuclear very expensive. To comply with today's regulatory environment makes nuclear energy not competitive with hydrocarbons. So a lot of people say it's not worth it. It's not competitive, but it's not competitive because the physics aren't there. It's not competitive because the regulatory costs are just wildly out of scale. So I think we've got to slowly change the regulatory regime, and as we build these new next generation reactors that automatically turn off. If everything goes wrong, they automatically shut down. There's no active cooling needed to keep them safe. They automatically turn off. They're smaller in scale, so we could sort of fabricate and then assemble, as opposed to a 10-year civil engineering project that today in our country always overrun on timing and cost. We got to get that down to some efficiencies of manufacturing and assembly. So I believe the cost of nuclear will come down a lot in the decades. The younger generation is much more pro-nuclear, mostly because of concerns about climate change. They look at nuclear as, hey, a dispatchable energy and it's got low to no CO2 emissions.
Right.
Let's embrace it.
Right.
This is a great thing. So we've
Right.
got a young generation that's more pro-nuclear. The technology's made great advancements. Yeah, I'm on the board of a small modular reactor company called Oklo. Tremendous technology. Like 5 years from now, we're going to be building reactors and putting them around this country. I visited more recently at a fantastic inertial confinement fusion company called Excimer, XCIMER. I worked on fusion 40 years ago. I followed it loosely. There are some big steps forward. It's further away than fission reactors, but are humans ingenious enough to make this work? Absolutely. So look, yeah, of course I'm optimistic about the future. There are many ways, or there are ways to produce more abundant energy and to continue to improve the safety, cost, and deliverability of those energy systems. And making the world better depends on doing it.
Yeah. Well, it takes good public relations. Fear can take over, like you say. But there's examples. France still has majority of their electrical sector supplied by nuclear energy. Germany used to have a larger percentage. They've mothballed. A lot of that is, as we have in the U.S., became reliant on imports. And as you mentioned earlier, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, that those imports, they were requiring Russian gas to come in, and we know that's led to um, really the destruction of some of their wind farms to try to get access to coal deposits so that they can go back and actually power their people. So there's laboratories out there. You mentioned Sri Lanka with the nitrogen-based fertilizers and how that was a real debacle. And there's decisions that have been made around the world, these laboratories that we can learn from, where they've, in the case of Germany, de-invested with nuclear and have had pretty stark realities hit them with that. So the more that we can learn and try not to replicate these mistakes, I would say is something that we should really strive for.
Let me
Fair?
expand. Very fair, Kyle. Let me expand on that. I do think these laboratories, and that's the right way to look at it. We can look at what's happened in California, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, and Sri Lanka, and zoom in over the impacts of the different trade-off selection they chose. Now, we talked about energy poverty, the lack of energy access in the developing world. I don't talk enough about in the developed world. The price of energy matters everywhere. So in the European energy system, they shrunk their own production of hydrocarbons. They invested heavily in wind and solar. And when they shrunk their own production of hydrocarbons, they didn't really replace it with solar and wind. They only work in the electricity sector. They just moved more domestic production to more imported production. So heavily reliant on Russian gas. They're still today heavily reliant on imported Russian gas. You never hear about that. From the southern pipelines, they're still flowing, including the one through Ukraine and one further south. But by getting overly dependent on Russian gas and the Nord Stream pipeline getting shut down, that further elevated the cost of heating, which meant that coal prices went up and wood prices went up. As you said, people put in wood burning stoves. They knocked over a wind farm to mine more coal. I mean, if you don't have energy, no other problem matters. That's the problem that matters. Then a lot of people say, well, they dodged a bullet in Europe. Thank God that next winter it was a relatively warm winter and there wasn't a Great Depression. Well, 10 to 20% reduction in industrial output in Europe that next winter. That's a big deal. That is a big deal. That's a lot of blue collar jobs. They've had virtually no economic growth over the last 2.5 years since the invasion of Russia and Ukraine. But maybe a more stark number, 65,000 excess deaths, freezing to death in the European Union in the first winter after the Russian Ukraine war. These aren't in the newspapers, right? Because they're not out in the streets. But when the price of heating gets more expensive, people rationally turn down their thermostats and they heat their residences to lower and lower temperatures. And if you're in poor health, you're elderly, maybe a combination of the two, and you heat your room less, they had people die. It's you make a heating expensive, you kill people. About 5 to 10 times more people die every year of the cold than die of the heat. Another fact you don't hear of much. So there's always excess mortality much higher in the winters. But they had an additional 65,000 winter deaths in the winter of 22-23 than they did in the previous winters. And it was a warmer than usual winter. So that energy policy, not only is it hamstrung them economically, geopolitically, it led to, and 65,000 is not a small number of deaths. That's just horrific. And we just don't hear about that enough. When states want to force, well, we're going to electrify heating. New York State, near New York City, they're going to electrify heating. Their dominant source of electricity is natural gas. Instead of burning it at the burner tip and getting 100 units of heat out of 1 unit of natural gas, they're going to burn it at a power plant and lose 100 and get 40 units of power that they're going to spend a lot of money to deliver electrically. They're going to make heating 2+ times more expensive, not to reduce emissions, but to feel green. Like that to feel green versus impoverishing and leading to more excess deaths. I'm not sure that's a good trade-off.
We talk about so-called green energy technologies, but we don't concentrate on the very non-green aspects that are behind a lot of this. To for our EV batteries, the mining of rare earth minerals in places that really aren't very receptive to human rights and the environment. You'll have strip mining. You'll have
Child labor.
cobalt being mined in the Congo to supply our batteries that are dying in artisanal mines. So there's a lot of human misery behind these so-called green initiatives that we in the first world can blind ourselves to. So even the technologies around solar panels and wind, just the amount of energy, again, yeah, high heat processes to build these massive wind turbines and the silica that's mined for these solar panels and they all have a life to them. And we're finding blades from some of the earlier windmills are finding their ways in the landfills and potentially damaging water sources that they may leach into and that kind of thing. So there's a whole I like to think about the full cycle around each one of these either energy storage or energy sources that we are using so that we all understand that there really isn't a renewable energy and there's really not a green energy, is there?
Key point you make, Kyle. Very key. But language is so powerful. We have clean energy and dirty energy. Well, who's not for clean? But as you just pointed out, there's no such thing as clean energy. All energy production is large scale and is highly physical. All energy production systems have meaningful impacts on the environment and the humans around. The question is this, they're just different. We call wind and solar green now because they have lower full cycle greenhouse gas emissions, and that they do, but they use much more land, much more materials, much more mining, much more human labor, uh, and have a much bigger broad environmental impact on the land of the earth, but they do reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere. So maybe they're negative on that one and they're plus on that one. But there's no clean and there's no dirty. There's just different sets of trade-offs. But if you win on the language, you tend to win. The other thing I've been very critical of our industry and everyone. I don't like that term energy transition, as I said, it's dishonest, it's not happening. And I also really don't like that term carbon pollution. Companies in my industry, we reduced our greenhouse or our CO2 pollution by 10%. And they use that term pollution where I think it's totally inappropriate. Pollutants are SOx and NOx and mercury and particulate matter that's harmful to human health. From the Clean Air Act and the EPA, we've dramatically reduced those. The air is cleaner. Death from air pollution and health problems has dropped dramatically because we made the air cleaner. Now, carbon dioxide absorbs infrared radiation. It is a greenhouse gas, but together with water and oxygen, it's one of the three most important molecules for life on Earth. Like it is critically important for life. It's transparent, it's odorless, it is not a pollutant by any stretch. But when you call it, and our industry calls it a pollutant, you scare kids about it because they want clean air. They want less pollution. I want less pollution. But we should not call methane and greenhouse and carbon dioxide emissions pollutants. They're greenhouse gases.
Well, they're plant food. At least CO2 is plant food. And we've seen a greening of the planet over the last 100 years. Our crop yields are up because of nitrogen-based fertilizers, but also CO2 in the atmosphere. It's feeding these plants and forests, reforesting the planet. Isn't that a good thing?
100%. That's a good thing. I say to kids, if you came from Mars and looked over planet Earth, the only visible impact of climate change is the planet's getting greener. Great NASA papers and data on this going back from 1982 to today, and the growth in the leaf area index,
Right.
the greenery, both in agricultural productivity and trees and grasslands and in the oceans, much greener, much more accommodating of life. Think of when the dinosaurs lived. The world was much warmer than it is today, and the CO2 concentration was much higher, and life was just abundant. Imagine how abundant life would have to be on the surface of the earth if 100-foot-long animals could walk around and eat. They walk around Denver, they'd starve in a day, in this semi-arid. It was just so much more biologic and plant matter because that warmer, more CO2 enriched atmosphere was just more welcoming to life. Now, the flip side of that is it's a change. We change the temperature, water expands, sea levels rise. I'm not saying climate change impacts are all positive, but they are a mix of the two, and that's rarely acknowledged. Again, in the rigorous area of climate economics, they do evaluate the pluses and the minuses. And this global greening, that more plant food in the atmosphere, that slightly better growing temperatures because it's a little bit warmer, that's hundreds of billions of dollars per year economic benefit of climate change.
And it's a wonderful extractor of CO2 from the environment that we're trying to mitigate. So, um, and I think,
Trade-offs abound.
yes. Yes, indeed. And a lot of the learned people that have written about the future state of the climate and the planet have failed to consider the power of the human intellect to adapt to conditions. And so, yes, we may have rising sea levels, but we certainly can move a bit inland when those conditions occur. We have
Build a
dikes
seawall.
and systems that have been set up and working for centuries in Denmark and New Orleans is famously below sea level, and we can deal with that. So, uh, and I think Bjorn Lomborg talks quite a bit about the power of our ability to adapt to changes. Um, so I think we've hit on some of this. I think it's clear that of all the world's problems, that you don't agree that climate change and even the global temperature projections that are coming out of the IPCC are nearly close to the top of the list of problems in the world. Fair to say?
Yeah, let me put that in quick context, Kyle.
Yeah.
Look at the 20th century. In the 20, and of course, global warming started before we put CO2 in the atmosphere. There's a natural component too of a cycle we're in right now, but we're definitely adding to it. But in the 20th century, sea level rose 8 to 9 inches, and the planet warmed by a little less than 1 degree centigrade. It is the greatest century of human progress ever. And throughout almost all of that century, no one talked or worried about the slight warming that was going on or the modest rise in the sea level. It just was the downsides were so little they were unnoticeable, and the benefits were enormous. So instead of 8 to 9 inches of sea level rise, if you extrapolate the first 23 years of this century's rate of sea level rise, we might get 12 to 15 inches of sea level rise, maybe 50% more sea level rise than we got last century. The current rate of warming, we might get 1.5 degrees C warming this century versus 1 degree C last century. So if a little bit less of both of those things was the greatest century of human progress, why would 50% more of those things be an existential threat
Yes.
or a crisis?
Yes.
Like, just what would make you think that?
Yeah. Well, it's people profiting both in power and money off of causing fear, obviously. So, if that's not the largest problem that we have, what should we as individuals and our communities do, you think, um, uh, to to try to get perspective on what those problems that are facing humanity? What should we be doing? Where should we be allocating our resources and our energies into, if it's not to try to reduce our carbon footprint to zero in our own households or in our own communities?
Yeah, look, I think the world has a lot of big problems, and that's my critique of climate change. Is if all your energy is there, it means you're not focused on the other ones. Look in the United States, our educational system in K through 12 is just really a colossal failure. We're the wealthiest, most innovative country in the world, and we don't rank in the top 30 for math education, science education, and reading and language skills. And to me, that's a simple structural problem. In Sweden, they have universal vouchers. The money from the government follows the kids, and they got a school system that if you don't get better, kids aren't going to go to your school. France has huge choices in education. But we still have kind of a Soviet style education system where you live in this zip code, you go to that school, and the money all goes to the teachers, and the parents aren't empowered. And look, we've seen the results, and the results are deeply inequitable. You know, middle class or upper middle class families, they move to where the schools are the best, or they put their kids in private school. But low income people don't have that choice. They already have less less educated parents, and they're forced to go to poor schools that often are violence. I chaired a scholarship organization for many years, and I'm still involved with it. We try to change the structure of schools. We raise money for low incomes. And for, again, here, a few $1,000s, you can change the trajectory of kids. Like, that's a huge solvable problem. I mentioned in the developing world, clean cooking fuels. Um, think of just malnutrition still kills millions of people a year. So people that work at food, biotechnology, better products, that's awesome. They're making the world a better place. What is Africa short of besides energy? Fertilizers, very low agricultural productivity in Africa. The biggest single driver of that, they just have wildly lower use of fertilizer. People become better farmers, then everyone doesn't have to be a farmer anymore, and you can develop a broader economy and more opportunities and lives. There are so many great challenges for young go-getter kids to work on today. Infrastructure for clean water in developing areas. Um, I could go on and on, and I should stop. But I think you've always got to put problems in perspective. And if solving climate change was just some new technologies and they would have spin-off benefits and all that, that's there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. But to date, most of the money in climate change hasn't gone into new research and new technologies. It's gone in subsidizing energy systems that just aren't a pathway to a better world. As we talk, they've made energy more expensive and less reliable, and we've exported industries. That's not good. I would say the other thing, to me, two things changed the world. We had 30-year life expectancy from before the invention of agriculture to 200 years ago. Today it's 73 years. What happened? What happened? To me, two things happened. Bottom up social organization, human liberty. We got rid of slavery. We enfranchised women. We allowed people to start businesses without the government having to grant you a license. You had to fill out paperwork, but you didn't need a vote of the parliament to get a limited liability charter. When we freed people to pursue whatever their ends were, this didn't legally become a reality, even in England and the United States, till the 1840s, and then it spread from there. And when we piled on massively more available energy than wood and whale oil, we added in coal and oil and natural gas, we made a world just wildly transformed. We've talked a lot about let's get those energy resources to people that don't have them yet today. We also want to get those human liberty resources to people that don't have them today. You know, why is Africa poor? To me, the simplest reason Africa's poor, they don't have rule of law.
Yes.
They don't have secure property rights. They don't have the basic infrastructure of human freedom, of human liberty.
Yeah.
And look, they didn't have it in our societies either. So pushing institutional reform and the basic ideas of individual property rights, markets, and rule of law, that's the other infrastructure besides the energy infrastructure that makes societies become wealthy and powerful. There's so much to be learned about that, so much to advocate in your local community, in your local area. There is a lot of stuff for energetic, great minds to make the world a better place. We just say, choose wisely, choose wisely.
Excellent. So you mentioned your activities that really just started this year in the foundation and getting those cooking fuels into Africa. You talked about the rule of law being missing in a lot of these locales, my guess.
Yes, yes.
Have you learned anything so far? I know you're partnering with groups and entities that were already in the business of trying to distribute fuel, and perhaps they've learned some lessons along the way, and perhaps you have too. Is there anything around that's we know so many examples of NGOs that have been unsuccessful because there hasn't been a rule of law. There's been resources intercepted, and people that really need are not getting from the organizations. Can you expand on anything that you've learned over the last few months?
So look, I'll say real quick, most of foreign aid, and I was a huge fan of foreign aid when I was in college in the 80s. Like, yeah, we've got it so good and other people don't. My God, we got a moral obligation to help them out. But most foreign aid had been government to government. So our government gives money to their government. Well, why don't they have rule of law? Why do they have corruption? Why do they lack property rights? Because their governments aren't doing what they should be doing. We ended out just giving more money and empowering the people that were the problem. So uh, my belief is the force for good is these bottom up social organizational forces. And the biggest one in the commercial area is business, right? So business is hard to be big business in Africa, hard for me to go over and be a big business in Africa. I've got to deal with the government and all that. But the force that's really driving progress in Africa is small business, little local entrepreneurs. Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Prize pioneering micro lending to very small to families, to women to get weaving machines, to build little micro industries. That has been a driver of it. So we're drafting off that idea and we're lending money, maybe in increments of tens of thousands of dollars, to small businesses, first in Kenya and Ghana. And you want to lend to successful entrepreneurs, not to aspiring entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship's hard. If you lend money to 10 people to start a business, nine of them are going to fail and that money's gone.
Right.
So we don't do that. We lend money to businesses that already exist today. They have customers that they're delivering clean cooking fuel to that pay them for that fuel. They buy that fuel from someone else and they have some way to move and deliver it. So they've already proven an entrepreneurial skill, but they can't get investment capital. Very few small firms can borrow money in Ghana, but if you can, it's 30 to 40% interest rate. No one can build a business off 35% cost of capital. And so they don't. They just bootstrap and they stay small. So what we're doing is lending money again in chunks, think 10, 25, $40,000 to these businesses who have to give us a plan about how is it going to be profitable to use this money, give us their repayment schedule, and we have one lender that's gone from supplying 5,000 families with clean cooking fuel to 15,000 families with clean cooking fuel. 25% of the loan in the first year is already repaid. So what are we going to do? We're going to lend that business more money as it continues to grow.
Yeah.
But logical, sober plans. You don't just go build a giant. They wanted to build manufacturing plants in the middle of rural Africa. People had ideas of trying to impose their view of society and their view of what's value on someone else.
Yes.
To me, that doesn't work. We want to go and see what's working in Africa and help it grow.
Yeah.
But that's the direction it goes and how it works. That's driven by the local African entrepreneurs. We're not there to teach them business. We're here to find the ones that are good at business and just enable them with low cost of capital, maybe a little bit of technology, and partnership. But that model, I think, works. And we wanted to prove that this year with almost all Liberty money. We plowed maybe $1.5 million into this. Next year, we'll be going around to other oil and gas companies and other people and say, this isn't just a good idea. This works. And we continually recycle that loan capital as it comes back. We lend them out. We're not for business purposes. It's a nonprofit, but we are lending to for-profit businesses to enable them to grow because that's the way forward for clean cooking fuel access in Africa.
Phenomenal. Well, Human Liberty, Liberty Energy, Chris, thanks so much. We are inspired by your vision, and I suspect Liberty Energy had a vision of its foundation at its outset, and so we thank you very much.
Kyle, it's been an honor to be here with you and to partner with the greater USC community.
Thanks again.
So everything we do requires energy from somewhere. That's one of the main takeaways we got from this episode.
Yeah, and as we heard, hydrocarbons use is interwoven into everything we do, not just power generation, but fertilizer, transportation, modern medicine, even our clothing. Anything, you name it, is most likely coming from fossil fuel contribution.
The scientist Vaclav Smil, he said the four pillars of the modern world are cement, steel, petrochemicals, and fertilizer.
And as we heard in this episode, there's an advocacy for nuclear energy. The passion about energy and the passion about honesty, it fuels the energy transition.
And if you look at the data, the transition is pretty hard to see, right? We're still using 85% of our energy is from fossil fuels. The energy transition is not really an honest term.
not for all of the above, but for all energy, that will certainly benefit human development, which I think was discussed in the episode.
Yeah. And decisions need to be made locally, not from higher levels of government, not from the US, the UN, or even the EU, but even as local as the home.
And decarbonization, it's happening naturally, driving market forces too.
A way to learn about sensible trade-offs in energy is the book Climate Economics by William Nordhaus, which shows how to really choose which one you want to prioritize.
Yeah, and with new examples, of the tech moguls, sobriety in decision making, being quote unquote energy sober, you should not be proud to spend dollars to make dimes and nickels, but we are emotional beings as humans, and we often follow these fads without even looking at the data. But language is powerful, and we have clean energy and dirty energy for who can't be clean.
Yeah, well, the Bettering Human Lives Foundation, which provides propane cook stoves in Africa, it keeps our focus on the humans, but with atmosphere as an important but secondary priority.
Chris Wright made it clear in his view that he doesn't criticize China and India for making the investments in the coal and natural gas that they have, because energy security is the top priority for people. Yes, we want to clean the environment. Yes, acknowledge the climate change is happening, but all of it, we can't forget the humans. His development of the Bettering Human Lives Foundation is an example that he's for whatever it is that helps people. If he was in their shoes, he'd be making these same kind of decisions. And so we have to, as hard as it is with our emotional decision making, we have to see through the emotion and sometimes the fear to look at the data to make the sober energy decisions. The issue with nuclear right now and why it isn't the perfect choice, it's easier to scare people than to inspire people. And we've scared people about nuclear with some of the historic accidents. The data doesn't align with the fear factor. So we have to be optimistic about the future and be data driven.
Have you ever been in a power blackout? We just kind of assume that when we flick the switch on the wall, the lights will come on. But how do we feel and how do we cope when they don't?
Well, it's kind of scary thinking about the folks in the path of the last hurricane in the United States. Some of them have even been without power for several days. Just think about all the devices we have that we need and that have to have access to power or run on batteries that need to be recharged.
In season 1, our podcast talked to Stephen Collins of SoCal Edison about power generation with a growing share of renewable energy sources. We learned what a duck curve was all about. And this season, we've invited Mr. Collins back to talk about the rest of the power grid, including transmission lines, distribution stations, and energy storage. We also will be talking to Steve Barry and David Longree from a different utility in Colorado to compare and contrast the pathways that different utilities can take on their net zero strategies.
We're also going to talk to a student, Malak, that had an interesting summer internship project at SoCal Gas and learn more about gas storage as part of the full energy systems that helps to keep the lights on and the AC on for us here in Los Angeles. Her job was to find ways to put natural gas back into the ground for times when we needed to supplement wind and solar.
We actually just celebrated our 100-year anniversary. So we were established in the 1920s. We are one of the few for-service municipally owned, community-owned utilities in the country. It's rare to have water, wastewater, electric, and natural gas under the same umbrella as a community-owned utility. So that's something we take a lot of pride in. It's something that I think it really differentiates us from privately owned utilities in that there is a direct line of sight between us and the customers we serve. Our customers basically own us, and we don't report to a public utilities commission in another city. We report to a locally elected utilities board that also serves as our city council. So I think that that is one of the biggest differences, that direct line of sight, that accountability, transparency. Our customers have a voice in their utility and the decisions we make. And so they are really integral in how we perform. And I think it does call us to a higher challenge in that we have to hit just that right balance between costs and reliability, and then our environmental stewardship, making sure that our operations do not negatively impact our local environment and our air quality. So I think it's a higher calling, so to speak.
And the way Colorado wrote this law, it's actually from 2005 levels. So Colorado and Colorado Springs specifically has seen a large amount of growth since 2005. So not only do you have to kind of overcome that additional emissions from just additional growth in the city, then you have to reduce that by 80%. So it is a very challenging thing for us to do, and that is what's driving the retirement of our 2 coal plants. We've seen, like I said, huge growth in just population, which is obviously drives the more use of electricity. And where I was going to go next too is we have and I'll hit this real quick and then jump back to directly answer your question. We also in Colorado passed the Clean Heat Plan law, which requires gas companies to reduce their emissions, and we're a gas company too, so we have to reduce our gas emissions by 4% by 2025 and 22% by 2030. Now there is a cost cap that's going to protect our customers from significant amount of rate increases. Because to be able to hit those targets would just cost an astronomical amount of money. But we're still looking to reduce our gas system. And really the way you do that is through electrification. So we've got load growth from population growth. We've got load growth on the electric side because we're electrifying buildings, we're electrifying the transportation sector. So all of that is causing the demand on the electric system to grow year over year. We're also now seeing the huge energy needs of AI data centers and just data centers as a whole as everything moves to the cloud. All of that is starting to take a kind of a linear growth of our load and starting to make it exponential. So yes, we're having to reduce our emissions, but our load growth is almost outpacing our ability to be able to reduce, especially as you get to that last 20% reduction. That's where it becomes extremely challenging because that load just continues to grow. And the wind, solar, the wind's not always blowing the solar, the sun's not always shining. Storage technology doesn't have the length to be able to cover all those other hours. So that last 20% is the big challenge. And that's really where Colorado is looking like where California is going, is what does that next step look like? Is it 90%? Is it 100%? And really, what's that cost to be able to do that? And you mentioned too, the rate base. So I think we serve more like 500,000 to 600,000 people in Colorado Springs area. So all the costs we don't have as much of a buying power, and we're attributing that cost to a smaller population. So the percent increase for our customer is going to be greater than an entity like Excel, who can distribute that over millions of customers. And so that is also, as we talk about rates maybe a little bit later, it's a really big deal for us that every dollar we spent is distributed over a smaller portion of people. Therefore, it's going to have a greater impact on their overall cost of service.
Thank you so much for joining us for the Future of Energy. Special thanks to each of our guests today and to our technical wizard, Abhi, for his important contributions to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to all our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.